The last speaker in this session is Professor Andrew Postlewaite from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Postlewaite is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and Director Emeritus of the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER. He is the founding editor of the journal American Economic Journal, Microeconomics. As all the other speakers in this session, he holds a PhD in mathematics. His research is in microeconomic theory and includes works on incentives, information, and social norms. In recent years, his work has extended to empirical work investigating the effect of juvenile height on self-esteem and career performance and on competition among siblings. His talk today is titled General Equilibrium Models in Economics.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank the organizers very much for organizing this and including me in the presentations. It's an honor to be here. I met David and Dahlia nearly 50 years ago when I went to the University of Illinois as my first academic job, and David came to visit the University of Illinois. And he continued over the years to visit in the United States in various places, and I kept up with him and developed a very warm and productive relationship, both personally and academically, over the years. The relationship that we had was one in which we spent a lot of time, I could say, discussing things. Sometimes it was closer to arguing about things. There were things that we talked about 40 or 50 years ago that we came to agreement decades later in terms of how we wanted to think of these problems. I've been asked to talk today about David's contributions to economics and his early work. He's best known probably for his work in decision theory, and then before that, as Professor Aumann talked about it, his contributions in game theory. David had a very productive career over the first decade and a half of his academic career after getting his PhD, and that was in, mostly in economics, mostly separate from game theory and decision theory. The work that he was involved in centered around one of the most important economic questions in economic theory of the middle of the last century, and that was general equilibrium. Let me take a minute just to talk about what the problems were in economics. The problems in economics, if you go back before the middle of the last century, were something along the following lines. I sit in my office as a researcher, and I'm writing down models trying to see what the effect of government policies to stimulate consumption, to get people to spend more. And I write down and analyze models that argue that the government should try to stimulate expenditure because that expenditure will raise the profits of the firms and they'll hire more workers and the workers will be better off. Everybody can be better off by stimulating demand, stimulating consumption. And across the hall from me is a colleague of mine who is analyzing a similar question, and she comes with models trying to argue that what the government should be trying to do is suppress consumption. And the argument is that if people consumed less, then there would be more money that was available in savings for firms, and firms would borrow more money, and they would hire more workers, and they would have higher profits. So that we have two opposite points of view. One saying that it's good to increase demand. The other saying is good to go in the opposite direction. The problem is that, in fact, we have incomplete models. Neither of our models that we're using have a model of sort of how the individual people, the consumers, are going to make their choices in terms of what they consume. Let me just ask the organizers. There's a clock in the back that hasn't started yet. I'm perfectly happy to do that. I've got more slides that I can cover, but
we're okay with
that I haven't used up my 20 minutes yet. So somebody will have to alert me as time goes on. No, it's
the amount of time you have left is on the computer.
no. No, they have one up here now. Now we're on my real time, so let me go on. So the idea was that what economics and economic theorists tried to do at this point was to develop models that included all of the relevant variables. And in this, it turned out to be a very difficult kind of a job, trying to find a set of conditions on the preferences and the choices of the individual people in the economy, and what are the possible firm choices in the economy, and to try to come up with a notion of an equilibrium that would exist for these kinds of models. The model that came to be known as the standard general equilibrium model was developed and published by Canero and Gerard Debreu. And it sets out a framework for general equilibrium that included enough of the variables to get around the kinds of problems I just mentioned. It proved the existence of price equilibria under, and I emphasize, under somewhat restrictive conditions on agents' preferences and on firms' possible production possibilities. And so this gave rise to a literature that went on for several decades, trying to expand the set of problems or the kinds of economies for which this notion of equilibrium would be supported. One of David's early contributions was a paper in Econometrica that expanded the set of preferences that people could have and still be assured that there was an equilibrium in the economy. There was a number of issues that people raised about the general equilibrium model. And let me get a little bit of water here. And maybe I won't. There are a number of issues that people worried about with the general equilibrium model. One of them was that the Debreu model was silent about how an equilibrium arises. The equilibrium notion was that there's a set of prices such that consumers maximize their utility or their what they would get out of this. Firms maximize expected profits, and everything clears. What people want to produce is consistent with what people want to purchase. Now, there was a question, though, as to how would this equilibrium arise? And one of the early possibilities was the cooperative game approach, talking about the core of an economy. Roughly, the core of an economy was the notion that there would be some outcome that arose, and that whatever was the process that people came to that outcome, it should have something of a group stability notion. That is, if in fact we have a set of people and they're told, here's what we think is going to be the outcome, it shouldn't be possible for there to be some subset of people to say, nope, we can walk out of this room, go to another room, and trade the goods that we have amongst ourselves and do better than what you're proposing. So the outcomes that survived this kind of sustainability condition were called the core of an economy, the set of outcomes that were stable with respect to these group incentives. David, along with others, some of whom were in the room, published an early paper on this existence of the approximate equilibrium cores, linking the idea of cores with the set of competitive equilibria, or the Walrasian equilibria of the economy. As Professor Aumann mentioned early on, he mentioned that one of the issues, one of the places where David made substantial contributions was with models of a continuum of traders. He went through the first 20 slides or so showing you this. I assume that you all absorbed the work and the slides that he gave you on that. I'll highlight a few things. This was a world in which you would have agents represented by individual infinitesimally small agents. David published early on a couple of papers. One, competitive equilibrium markets with a continuum of traders and incomplete preferences, again extending the set of economies for which this model was going to be appropriate. Another, cores and prices in an exchange economy with an atomless sector, was one that combined standard finite numbers of agents along with a continuum of agents. There was a third contribution that was very important in retrospect particularly. It was a remark on the core of an atomless economy. The notion was that the core was going to be good because it asked for group stability. So it had the idea that a group of agents might in fact have some kinds of market power. And the idea was that we might in fact capture things like labor unions or of groups of workers that might in fact get together and be able to get more than they would have otherwise if they were unorganized. David's paper was seminal in the sense that what he showed was that no, the groups of agents that were going to be important for the core were not what you thought of as being the groups that had some power. It wasn't labor unions, but rather it was going to be coalitions of people that were very diverse. They were not going to be concentrations of agents. That diminished the interest in the core because it seemed it was a mathematically interesting insight, but it didn't really help people understand the real world economies that they were interested in. There were non-cooperative foundations of general equilibrium, and that is that they abandoned the cooperative game theory of core to try to understand things. In the non-cooperative, there was a question are there going to be mechanisms that we can think of where agents, individuals, never had an incentive to manipulate the system? It was understood that, in fact, with a standard price mechanism, I might be able to manipulate things by saying, I don't really want that kind of a good that you're offering to trade as much as you thought I did, and therefore I might be able to affect the price that I would have to pay. The question was, are there mechanisms that could we add some regulations? Could we add some kinds of constraints on an economy so that we could get a system that nobody had an incentive to manipulate? And the answer was no. This was Hurwicz's contribution that led in part to his Nobel Prize, that there was no way to, in fact, do things so that you could be sure that no agents ever had an incentive to lie or try to manipulate. The next step was, could you try Nash equilibrium? Could you find games or strategic situations in which agents might not be able, you might not be able to prevent all manipulation, but could you get one where after you manipulate and I manipulate optimally given what you're doing, could I find an equilibrium in the manipulations that led to good outcomes? There was some hope that you might be able to get that. One of the strands of the literature that went down this line was prompted by work by Shapley and Shubik, trying to write down mechanisms that captured the process by which people were making trades and in real markets. And there were two papers that David and I wrote along these lines, in which the idea was agents were going to put goods on the market for trade, other agents were going to put other goods on the market for trade, and what I got was going to depend on how much I put on the market of oranges for apples and how much people put apples for oranges. And what we were able to show in that paper was that when you had large numbers of agents in general, there was going to be a Nash equilibrium that had the property that it was close to a Walrasian equilibrium. That is, this provided a foundation for Walrasian or competitive equilibria. When there were large numbers of agents, there would be an equilibrium in which you got something close to a Walrasian outcome. I say an equilibrium because there were multiple equilibria typically in these kinds of problems. I'll say more about that in one slide. There was a second paper that linked the equilibria of those formally to approximate Walrasian equilibrium. David wrote several other papers. One of these included included money in the model, which most of the models up to that point had not. There was a second strand of literature along the lines of trying to find mechanisms for which all Nash equilibrium outcomes were exactly efficient. Could you find mechanisms, rules for how people would trade or produce that had that property? David with Leo Hurwicz had an early paper on this in which they were able to demonstrate a mechanism. It wasn't necessarily one that fit the Walrasian or Ehud notion of an economy, but it's one that showed that for a related kind of a model, you could find games that had the property that all of the equilibria were perfectly efficient. He wrote a generalization showing that this kind of thing was possible in the standard Ehud world, the same kind of a world that Ehud and Debrew had laid out. And he showed that the existence, how you could construct mechanisms that had the property that all of the Nash equilibria of the game were precisely the outcomes that you wanted, the Walrasian outcomes. There were non-cooperative foundations. Everything I've talked about up to this point were papers that David wrote in which the standard model was that there was privacy of what people cared about. You don't know what my preferences are, what kinds of things I particularly value or not. But that other than that, there was no asymmetry. And that there was nothing of the sort that said, well, maybe the government might introduce some kind of a policy, but we're not sure. And maybe I know more about the possibility of something like that arising than you do. Everything up to this point had been with no differential information. The information that people had was what their preferences were, what were the things that they wanted to buy, but nothing about other things in the economy. David and I had tried to extend the idea of this implementation that he had done in the private preference model that I described. And we wrote two papers. One was a general outline of the conceptual difficulties that come up if you wanted to try to extend this to worlds in which there was differential information of the sort that I knew things that you cared about, but you didn't know as much, that we differentially were informed about things that might arise in the economy. The formalization of this was a paper, there was a formalization of this showing a general equilibrium approach to these problems, and then the formal mathematical representation of what were the necessary and sufficient conditions for which you could design mechanisms with differential information, economies that gave you good performance. So these were the papers that David wrote that captured much of the work that was being done from the middle of the century for about the first decade and a half of David's academic career. It's a portfolio of outcomes that would warrant a meeting like this if he didn't do anything in game theory itself, and if he had never decided to work on decision theory. It's an outstanding portfolio. And I'll mention that economic models are disparaged by some people, including some people in this room, I think. But the basic models in macroeconomics now, all of the things that David worked on were in what we could think of as the microeconomic sphere. but all of the basic models in macroeconomics, trying to understand the macroeconomy. All of those models are derivatives of the kinds of models that David had contributed to and isolated the important ingredients. I will close, but I'll say that David did do several other things that are related to this, but outside of the formal framework of the Euro de Breu economy, and they had to do with equity. And the question was, what could we say about the fairness of a mechanism that gives us Walrasian equilibrium? And he had one paper with Carl Wind, and then he had two papers with Alicia Posner that talked about fundamental difficulties in trying to extend formally the Walrasian or the general equilibrium model to worlds in which there were goods that I couldn't transfer to you. That is, there's my time that I have value for, and I like it, but I can't sit there and say, look, I'll give you some of my spare time if you'll give me some of your oranges. So that's the end of the things that I have to say about this. I'll just reiterate what I said at the outset. It's an outstanding portfolio of research that David had. I learned a huge amount. I learned more from David than probably anybody else that I've worked with over the years. Thank you.